There are secrets out there, guys, performance marketing secrets, and knowing just one or two of them can absolutely light up your funnels. Let's go. This is the Revenue Driven CMO. I'm your host, Chris Mechanic. Join me as I uncover the secrets of the world's most elite CMOs and marketing leaders. The Revenue Driven CMO is sponsored by Web Mechanics, the AI-driven performance agency that makes you smarter. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another exciting episode of Revenue Driven CMO. I am your host, Chris Mechanic, and I'm super excited for today's episode. We've got an awesome guest in store for you today. Our guest today is a problem solver by nature. He balances really, I would say, creativity with an entrepreneurial spirit. Um, he's led marketing for startups, Fortune 500 companies, global agencies, in SaaS, in B2B, in B2C. He's really a very well-rounded marketer, and I would say like a great blend of art and science, which we really love here on the show. Currently, he's Chief Marketing Officer at MetaMap, which is a really exciting, fast-growing company all about customer identity and discovering untapped potential therein, which we'll learn a lot more about. But ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show, Mr. Dan Buczaczer. How are you, Dan?
I'm great, Chris. Thanks for that incredibly generous introduction. And I agree with you. I'm super passionate about blending art with science. It's actually why I got into marketing in the first place. The idea that I could do both seemed too exciting to pass up.
Yeah, I have a similar story, which I may get into here in a second, but we got a lot to cover, and I'm super excited to be speaking with you. Um, and I'm definitely interested to learn more about MetaMap. But before we do, you know how we like to roll. We like to lead, with the value. Tell us, what is one of the biggest or one of your best kept secrets to success in marketing?
Yeah, I think it's a best kept secret for me because it's something that I've really learned over time. I'd say I jumped into marketing for the art side, and we'll probably get into that a little bit later.
Yeah.
But what's really been captivating me more and more recently is the science side. And so the secret that I feel like I've unlocked more and more myself recently is this idea of building what I call the ultimate experiment driven culture.
Mhm.
And you know, to experiment is probably not a big aha for anybody on listening to this podcast. We all experiment regularly.
Yeah.
But what I feel like I've been on this sort of path of discovery is really understanding what that means to build an entire culture based around it. I feel like the more I've been in this job, the more I have realized I'd say I'm wrong like 60% of the time when I'm
Right.
trying to speculate something. And so that's a little humbling. It's sort of like flipping a coin would be a better way to decide than going with my gut.
Yeah.
And so it's really this idea of how do you build a very intentional culture around experimentation at its core?
Yeah. Yeah. So how do you do that exactly? Because I know, we work here with many different clients. Some are inclined towards experimentation. Some are, I think, by nature, sort of not opposed to it necessarily, but they are resistant to new ideas and change. How do you enter into an organization and start building that culture, especially where one may not have existed before?
Well, obviously, the more you can start to show results from it, the more that folks will come along with you.
Yeah.
But I kind of have three elements when I think about what does that mean to kind of be a culture, a culture that's experiment driven. Number one is you have to do it regularly and continuously and not just in one area, right? I think demand generation is an area where everybody kind of shakes their head and goes like, yeah, of course you're experimenting. You're trying this audience versus this audience, A/B testing. Another might be sort of some product design elements, right? The
Mhm.
red button or the blue button is kind of the classic. But
Right.
I'm talking about sort of across your organization. How can you find opportunities to do this in as many different areas as possible? This could be messaging, targeting, creative channels. If you have a free tier or a product-led growth motion, persona development, positioning, there's opportunities to kind of test and learn in all of these areas.
Yeah.
Um, Number two is be structured about it. So a lot of times people associate experimenting with, well, let's just try it. But I
Yeah.
actually think there's a lot more rigor and structure you need to bring to get the most out of it, and that
Yeah.
also helps to bring people along as you mentioned. And then the third is making sure that all of these experiments are building towards putting together a broader, more cohesive strategy. So you need to show that this is all coming together. These are pieces of the puzzle that are starting to form a more complete picture. And I think
Yeah.
that's really been instrumental with getting people to buy in.
Yeah. No, there's a lot there. So and I think you're right that in demand gen, it's really easy to experiment. Uh Experimenting in other areas I think might be a little bit new for people. Um So, what would you say there are the top areas that you like to experiment in, like other than demand gen? Is it mostly around messaging and product positioning, or like are you talking about even like recruiting, for instance? Do you experiment there?
That's a great one, recruiting. I haven't run as many recruiting experiments, but I love that idea actually. I think we should, because again, I think there are all sorts of assumptions we make in recruiting, in terms of who we think we're looking for, et cetera, that I think if there's more structured as an experiment, it can work a lot better. We have a free tier at MetaMap.
Mm.
I had one at Labelbox as well, which was my job just previous to this one. And I think that's a phenomenal place to experiment, not only to try to understand a customer who's in buying mode but not ready to talk to a salesperson, but
Yeah.
also we have imported so many learnings from free tier into the actual paid product as well. And
Mm.
so we have slowly been forming hypotheses around what we think are the aha moments in the product when you first start to use it that get you to fall in love.
Yeah.
And it's been this really interesting process of understanding if that's true. In other words, customers who reach those moments, are they more likely to upgrade? Are they more likely to talk to a salesperson? But
Yeah.
also, how do we get them to those moments? And so everything from, tours to checklists to we had a checklist that those who were engaging with it was doing incredibly well, but almost nobody was using the checklist. And so we became more intrusive with it. Instead of sort of hiding it off in the corner, we made you start by sort of acknowledging it. And that actually worked incredibly well. Um,
Yeah.
and then, all sorts of email sequences to follow up with those who engage or don't engage. Um, so anyways, those are like some examples within free tier. Each one of those ends up being an experiment where we run it, we see what kind of results we get, we sort of um, discuss what's working, what isn't working about it, and kind of determine what we think is the next action coming out of it.
Yeah. And then one more thing on that first point of regularly and continuously. Like I know that a lot of times there will be a lot of excitement around testing, and then, a couple tests get done. They may be failed tests, they may be inconclusive where that test is just running, for a long time and there's no clear winner. And then that excitement sometimes begins to fade. How do you keep it regular? Like, do you have a quota for testing? Like, is it like, hey, must do 3 tests a month in each area? Or like, how do you kind of keep that regularity going even when sometimes the results may be discouraging or non-existent?
Yeah. We do a little of it using quotas, like you said, run at least 3 this quarter, 4, whatever it is. But I think the other really important thing is making sure we do this quarterly, but there's other cadences you can run this at. Um, Make sure that the experiments you're running are ideally flowing from objectives that you've set for the quarter. So we do OKRs at MetaMap. And so, for example, one of our core OKRs in demand gen this quarter is improving our conversion rate from marketing qualified accounts to sales qualified accounts. We see a drop off there that is suboptimal for us. We want to improve that. So really the goal becomes that's actually the objective for the quarter is we need to fix that. So if we
Yeah.
run one experiment and we get there and we sort of double it and we're there, it's not necessarily let's just keep running them because we promised ourselves we were going to run 4. But more
Yeah.
likely you run 1. If you're not seeing the bump, now the question is, do you experiment on top of that? Do you kill that and go in a different direction? But that's what we try to use to lead us instead of just kind of setting a number and going with it. So it really is more about we've kind of pointed at the point in the distance that we want to get to, and now it's just a question of what path it's going to take to get there.
Yeah. That makes a ton of sense. That makes a ton of sense. And then it brings real like meaning behind the test. And
Yes.
because a lot of critics of testing, or when people are critical of testing, it's sometimes the critiques are around what I would call more of the superficial tests, like, this color versus that color, or, is the image going to be on the left or the right? Like those things aren't really deep enough psychologically to impact an objective, probably like increasing MQL to SQL conversion rates. I just think that this is such a timely topic, like especially in 2023, like the general MO amongst B2B tech and SaaS companies is really like, this is the year of efficiency. Like everyone was
Totally.
sort of spending like a drunken sailor for the last like couple years. Um, and this has really been all about efficiency. And I think that testing and conversion rate optimization is probably the most powerful lever in that it can really be like a rising tide that lifts all ships. But I think it's also mostly underutilized. Like if you poll 100 CMOs, almost all of them would be like, yes, of course we're testing. But if you double click into that and you kind of dig beneath the surface, you'll find that they're probably not very structured about it, or very rigorous in their methodology. It's more of like a hey, let's test everything, sort of a test protocol. But what were you going to say? Right
No,
as I was.
I totally agree with that. First of all, I think doing more with less is definitely sort of the mantra that I think all companies are on right now, and we certainly are. And I appreciate that. Like, I actually prefer that, to be honest with you. I think the constraints so that you have to be more strategic, be more methodical to get to where you're going. I sort of appreciate that challenge more than who can throw the most money and kind of get there fastest, you know?
Yeah.
But when you talk about structure, I really think that is the key. So for us, it's, setting those objectives for the quarter. Experiments kind of flow out of that as, okay, what experiments are we going to run to try to achieve those objectives? The next step is actually not to jump into the experiment. It's to collect any research you have. Oftentimes, going back to the example of free tier, what can we learn if we go over all of the user data we already have on free tier? What does it look like they're doing, they're not doing? When I talked about those aha moments, we were hypothesizing at first exactly what those were. We actually didn't know when we started.
Mhm.
So we made our best guesses, but we made those guesses based on the data where it looked like, and we didn't have very many users when we started, but where did it look like people were engaging, as well as with our paid customers as well. Like, what's our best guess on where they really start to gain traction? So wherever you can get research, I think it's useful. Then you design that hypothesis. I think that's the other thing, Chris, that causes these experiments not to die out as much is you go in with your best guess. We all took, science in high school, so we know how this works, but try to define a hypothesis. That way, you know what the finish line is, as well as the metric, like what is the expected result in a quantifiable way for that hypothesis. If you're falling short, if you are way surpassing it, and then you can start to uh, interpret why you think that happened. And that hopefully gives you the momentum to go on to the next step. I think socializing is also huge. Socialize before the experiment is run. I can't tell you how many times someone has given me a really smart piece of input that saved me a ton of time up front because they're like, that's not going to work. And here's why. And I was like, okay,
Yeah.
well, then let's not run that experiment. Like, let's kind of, work off of that. And then interpreting on the back end as well. So we were doing something recently where we were looking over a bunch of analysis on enterprise versus mid market, and enterprise churn numbers suddenly started to look really bad. Long story short, after digging into it and socializing with a lot of other people, realized that there was a period of time that a salesperson who came well before me had used a very quirky definition of enterprise that somehow included a whole sector that they just wanted to give to a certain rep. And
Yeah.
so for that reason, they made that decision. So we didn't actually have an enterprise churn problem. We had a definition problem in Salesforce, but it's
Mhm.
only sometimes by socializing results and just being able to openly ask, we don't know why this happened to you. And all of a sudden you get back some really interesting input. So you don't have to feel, I think, like you are the, sort of the master, here's the answer from on high. Sometimes it is getting back results and saying, what do you all think? Why do you think this is? And you get some really interesting perspective across the board, whether it's, engineering, sales, product, et cetera.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense too. And I'm sure that I've wasted a ton of time probably by failing to socialize things. Um, we have this nifty template that we use when we go about testing. We call it the conversion matrix or the experiment matrix. And it basically lays out each hypothesis on a row. And then
Love
each
it.
hypothesis is scored uh, by things such as technical difficulty, like how difficult is this technically? Creative difficulty, how much creative will this require? The current baseline of whatever that conversion rate is always on there. Known data gaps, like how confident are we? There's a confidence score, and then there's an impact score, which is if we're right about this, how big of a deal is it? Like, is it just like an incremental improvement in click through rate, or is it like 20% increase in revenue, on the high end? So then we crunch all those together to prioritize those experiments. And that helps us to be structured. And then that document, like anytime anybody gets an idea, any random idea, it goes onto that document. And then you end up with 100 ideas and you go through and take the time to score the ones that are most promising. What kind of system do you guys use to like stay structured like that? Are you using some sort of tech or tool, or is it mostly kind of Asana and spreadsheet driven, like in our case?
We throw them all into Monday. So we use Monday as a base.
Oh, nice. I love
Asana is
Monday.
another great one. Yeah, I do too. I love how you can kind of set notifications. You can kind of comment on individuals. So we get entire streams, threads going about kind of particular experiments and questioning and leading to other boards, etc. And we actually have separate experiment boards kind of by section of marketing. So product marketing has one, demand generation has one, content has one. So we sort of have a variety of experiment boards that lets each owner kind of run their own. We've played around with some weighted scores similar to what you were talking about, not as in depth as the one that you actually went through, though. That's really interesting. I'd love to see that. Um, we've played around with some weighted scores, but at least for this company where we are now, what we're really letting lead the decision on which experiments to prioritize is based on starting with those objectives and just making a call sort of, in a group setting, determining what we think are the bets that we most likely want to prioritize to that will help us get to those objectives. So it's a little less about creative and technical. We sort of try to find a way at least to get to the MVP, which is another big thing around experiments that I always approach it, which is the first version does not have to be perfect. I love,
Yeah.
it's probably my favorite principle from the world of product is how quickly can you get a beta out there using as little resources as possible to at least give you signal, right? So I'm always a big fan of, even if we don't have the perfect piece of content, let's say behind the ad or behind the landing page, can we get up the ad or the landing page promising the piece of content? The content may not be great on the other end, but if we see amazing click through, for example, in that case, we know we'd better invest in actually building that piece of content that can better convert. So
Yeah,
I'm just a
totally.
really big fan of that because most of the startups I've worked at have been Series B, Series C, Series D. You don't have the luxury of time to kind of build everything out perfect the first time. You really do have to iterate incredibly quickly.
Yeah, so it's not build it and they will come. It's more so the opposite almost. Like see if they come and then if they do, then build it.
Totally. I'm a big fan of, I call them first drafts too. Like, let's launch the first draft. That's going to be enough to start to tell us if we've got something or not. It also, I think, helps surface the questions you didn't think about. So we were just very recently having an internal debate about what I call the go-to-market priority framework, which is exactly who are we focusing on by country, by industry, kind of a sharpening of our audience. And there was all sorts of debate about, well, we still want to see this and we want to see this and we want to kind of run a couple more experiments and talk to more salespeople. And I finally said, let's launch it. We've seen enough to launch it. Once we launch it, we can adapt from there. It's not set in stone, as you said earlier. And so we did. We did this just about a month ago. And I got to tell you, the number of people who have come forward and said, okay, but here's a concern and here's a worry. In general, it is holding. Like, I would say it was kind of 80% strong. But what we're learning I think is so much deeper, because people have something to react to. It's so much more, um, the feedback is just sharper in terms of, "This is what I think you're missing here," and so we have, continued to optimize it as we go. I think we've made some really helpful optimizations to it, but it was only by kinda getting that first version out into the world and saying, "We're going for it. We feel 80% confident," that I think you start to really, be able to fill in those gaps way more efficiently, again, to use that word.
Yeah, absolutely. And we one time saved a client like hundreds, if not thousands of hours of potentially wasted time. They were in the financial services space, and it was a really high touch sale. Like it was like a phone based sale. They couldn't do it online, but they were really interested in doing like a self service kind of like, enroll, like self enrollment online. So they're like telling us about this and we're getting excited about it in theory. And somebody was like, hey, how about we just put a link like on the thank you page, for instance, that's like, hey, you want to enroll yourself? Like just click here just to see how many people click on it.
Right.
And I think we did something like when somebody clicked on it, it would like trigger a little light box that was like, oops, like it's not yet ready yet. Put your email address in here or something. Um, and we expected that at least 30 or 40% of people would click on that, but it was like crickets. Like nobody wanted to self enroll online, surprisingly to everybody.
Such a great example. It gets back to that 60% of the time being wrong. I mean, I've been in marketing for a while and I feel like, when you do your 360 feedback, like I always hear, "Oh, you're a good listener, you understand the customer." So I'm liable to think I should be able to trust my gut, but I can't tell you how many times I say, "Well, I'm pretty sure they're going to choose this, but let's test it." And then I'm wrong. And it's so humbling. And I actually think it adds to the fun of this. I sort of love the fact that we can't properly predict, um, exactly what humans are going to do in any one situation. And so I just think the sane thing, it's the logical thing to do is just to let the market tell you. And I've used it many times with the CEO too, I have to say, who, CEOs have gotten to where they've gotten because they followed up on something that they believed in and they dug in and they, pushed past a lot of naysayers who said this can't be done and there's no way. And so they pride themselves, rightly so, on sort of proving the doubters wrong. And so it's
Yeah.
always interesting for a marketer to have to come in and then say, I don't think that's what people are going to go with. And I have found that a well run experiment can very often, not always, but very often, really help them see it differently and start to change their minds. Otherwise, you're just having an argument back and forth. And I don't blame a CEO for not caving when it's just one opinion versus another. And frankly, they're the opinion of the person that got the company this far.
Yep. Yeah, good old hippo. Have you heard of that? The hippo?
No.
The highest paid person in the room's opinion.
There you go. Exactly.
Yeah. Cool. So we got through the first two portions of your framework. Let's talk about the third one real quick, just making sure that everything builds toward a more cohesive strategy. That seems pretty self explanatory, very logical. And I could see how that could breathe ongoing life into a testing program that, is just like based around some higher purposes. Is there more to that third piece that you want to mention?
Well, I just think this is where, starting with that core objective, having an overall North Star metric that you're headed for. As a company, we revisit our North Star metric every year. We're about to go through it again here for 2024 very soon. And so I think it's important to have that strategic framework to begin with, right? We've got our North Star metric, we've got our core pillars that we believe differentiate us from the competition, and we have kind of our set of objectives, our kind of four overriding objectives for the year that the
Yeah.
whole company is trying to steer towards. And so really when you finish an experiment, understanding okay, so now where does that fit back into that, to use that puzzle analogy again, like we've got the piece, now where exactly does it fit? I think that is what's most important. And that's what helps you not get sort of down a rabbit hole on any one experiment or just being able to make the most out of those results. And so um, that is the benefit, I think, of a well-defined hypothesis, really setting those benchmarks up front, doing that research, all of that was hopefully in service of understanding why this will matter or not, depending on what you learn. And, I mean, this hopefully goes without saying for your audience, but obviously a failed experiment is just as valuable, if not more, than a successful experiment. But I think really sitting down and doing that retro afterwards and trying to determine why do we think and so what's next is the piece that is so crucial there. And I just think all of that leads up to telling us kind of what's going to work and what isn't going to work. And for example, in really defining the audience for MetaMap, which has actually been quite an ongoing journey to understand exactly who the buyer and user are in this case, I think we've learned as much from failed experiments as we have from successful ones in that case.
Yeah. Yeah, I can definitely see that. I want to talk about MetaMap in a minute, but I always love win stories. I would love to hear a win story. I know you've only been there for it looks like about a year based on LinkedIn. But are there any big, like, winning, experiments you can tell us about either at MetaMap or in one of your previous lifetimes just to kinda get everyone's juices flowing?
I'm trying to think about like the off the charts single experiment because it feels like it so often comes in fits and starts. But
Little bits, right?
I think the biggest progress we've made at MetaMap is you know, Met so I know MetaMap's coming up next, so forgive me that I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but MetaMap is really built with a pretty big vision in mind. Of where we wanna get, and it's kind of a big, bold vision that is gonna take years to kind of, come to fruition. Um, and I think the biggest and so as a result, a lot of the engineering time, a lot of the product time is invested in trying to get to that, basically building that castle for the future.
Mm,
Um, but we're selling MetaMap now, like, we're making deals now, and so I think the biggest gains we have had this year have really been realizing exactly what today's customers are doing versus tomorrow's, and of course, there's, the often abused, quote about, Henry Ford asking them what they'd want, and they'd say, "Faster horses," and, that's true, but if we're not ready to start selling the Model T, like, let's sell some horses, you know? And
yeah,
so I actually think a really interesting challenge has been figuring out what they want out of us today and what we can do, while also hopefully recognizing within that customer base who seems ready for this future version. Because we're sort of running some betas in the background of where we're trying to go. So we want the right customers in our customer base, but at the same time, we've got revenue goals like anybody else. And so I think that's been a lot of fun. Like, uh, MetaMap is late Series B, but I keep saying in some ways they're actually a Series A because I think they used that first money to just really try to start to build that product of the future, which is really exciting. But in a lot
yeah,
of ways, we're also still determining sort of exactly why we win. Um,
yeah,
and so that's been really interesting. And so I think we have a much different and improved vision now of our audience, why we win regularly, how we stack up against competition. And so it's kind of interesting to be doing that while hopefully having a secret ace up our sleeves for the future of kind of where we hope to head.
yeah, that's really interesting. That's really interesting, and an exciting, but, potentially challenging predicament to be in, just in terms of, the Henry Ford analogy where it's like everybody's buying horses, but you've actually got a Model T, like, is anybody gonna want this?
Totally,
Um,
right. I mean, Model T is the positive example, and then, of course, there's all the Betamaxes of the world that show, sometimes people aren't ready, as much as you're like, "But I swear it's so much better."
right,
People aren't ready, and so that's what I think that, really focusing on how can we win now, I think also helps us hopefully get there because we're not just building and wishing, we're also actively learning with current customers sort of where they're willing to go, where they're not. I love using the example of Apple all the time, which is, you know, um, they're always working on 2 to 3 iPhones ahead of time, but when they're up on stage, they're launching this phone with this camera as if it's the greatest thing you will ever see in the world. They know there are generations ahead of kind of where they're gonna go, but their job right now is to sell that iPhone and make you want this one and fall in love with it. And by watching how people use this one, they're also going to learn and start to modify for where they're headed next. It's not sort of like set in stone. And so I like to use that analogy all the time because they're great at convincing you that what they've got today is the best it's going to get.
Right, right. Yeah, that's really interesting. Cool. Well, I think you've got everybody really curious to know more about MetaMap and to understand exactly what it's all about or who might use it. You want to give us kind of like an overview of MetaMap and just kind of what some of the top use cases are?
Yeah, totally. So MetaMap, as you mentioned, is in the space of identity verification. But what I think is most interesting about it is we're focused on emerging countries. So primarily in Latin America and Africa. And two
Oh,
things are
interesting.
interesting there. Number one, there's been an absolute explosion of fintech companies there, right? These countries largely had just very traditional banks that had been around for generations, not quite as much experimentation as maybe the US or Europe. And so now with the internet, so widely spread and companies starting to and just startups starting to take hold there are just a wave of companies trying really interesting things with finance. The
Mhm.
other really interesting thing is there is no massive Experian or Equifax or kind of company that has been around for decades and decades that is sort of the single authority on how creditworthy you are. And
Mhm.
so as you know, if you're a big bank, you just say, well, tough, like, you know, uh, not approved, not approved, not approved. If you're a startup and you don't sort of have that base of customers, um, you can't just rely on that. You've got to be able to start to get a little bit more scrappy in terms of how you figure out if maybe they're credit worthy. Maybe not for $1 million loan, but maybe for $1,000 loan, right? And so what MetaMap really helps with is how can we help connect these potential customers to as many different data sources there are about them, right? It's where they live. It's, yes, of course, how much money they have and some, basics in terms of just kind of the core statistics we have about them. It's
Mhm.
obviously kind of, court records, stuff like that, potentially. But it can also be their job, where they work, how long they've worked there. Do they work for something like a ride sharing company? If so, how many ratings do they have and what's their average rating, right? There are all these other signals that someone is potentially trustworthy, reliable, responsible, that we may not think to use in the United States, but that actually could be incredibly good signal for a lot of these countries. And two-thirds of the world's population is actually essentially unbanked. They don't have access to these kinds of services.
Yeah.
So not only is there a tremendous opportunity to get more of these people more opportunity, which feels great, but if you're talking to a major bank in Colombia, let's say, it also represents a huge opportunity for them to make more money because
Right.
they're not looking at a huge portion of their population right now, which is crazy. And of course, some segment of them are potentially fraudulent or criminals. So, we need to be careful. This isn't about letting everyone in, but it is about really understanding where that's actually true and where they were just too risk averse before to take that chance. But if we can give them more information, it suddenly doesn't feel like such a risk.
Wow. So, without getting too granular, how does MetaMap get that data? So, for instance, like in the ride, in the individual that works for a ride share company, like you guys get all that data automatically and in real time.
So, I mean, it's a lot. Our data team is very, very busy. It's a lot of individual deals that we strike. So we often buy that data. And a lot of we're not the only ones that buy a lot of that data. But what we are doing, we think better than anyone, is i- uh, integrating all of these different data types onto a single platform. So that
Mm.
if I'm looking at you, Chris, and I can see your profile and I can switch on or off what's important to me and what limits are important to me and get back a really quick risk assessment score because I'm potentially signing up 100 customers a minute on my website. So I need to make these incredibly fast decisions, and then on the back end, I need really good data that shows me how I did and what that resulted in over time, so that I can decide if I want to tighten up or loosen up kind of some of my criteria. So it's
Right.
really about that integration of a lot of different data types, but we're also starting to do things like letting customers upload their own data as well into it. So you can mix some proprietary data, along with kind of third-party data. So yeah, it comes from
Interesting.
governments, it comes from companies, it comes from a wide range of places.
Wow, that's really interesting. Very cool. Well, and so are you guys pretty much focused exclusively international? Like most well, it sounds like most of your business is there, but is all your business there, or do you have US based customers too?
Overwhelmingly, our business is there. We do have a few US customers, a few like Western Europe customers. Um, and the reason we're focused there is a couple of things. Number one, the market's not nearly as mature. There are companies in the US that have been doing something sort of similar for a while. And like we said, everyone still looks first and foremost to, Equifax, Experian, et cetera,
Right.
FICO scores, et cetera. Um, but the other reason why is so there's a better chance to be competitive, but there's also this really exciting deficiency in sort of a common standard right now. And so I use the analogy sometimes of, Africa didn't have nearly the landline penetration for phones that other countries did. So when cell phones came, it was truly a revolution where they almost skipped a generation. And I think there's really that possibility here as well. My CEO's argument is that, FICO and some of the traditional credit agencies are hardly perfect. In fact, they're far from it. He's an example of it where he grew up in Poland, went to Wharton, has a startup with millions of dollars in the bank, and yet when he was in the United States and he did start this company, he was in San Francisco, he couldn't get someone to rent him an apartment because nobody trusted him. And he's like, "But I have all of these other indicators that would lead you to believe I'm a pretty decent risk on some level."
Yeah.
Um, but they didn't care because they would just go to Equifax and they'd say, "Oh, not a US citizen, don't have enough data on this person." And so people were like, "No, thank you." We couldn't open a bank account, right? So
Wow.
even the United States is actually broken. So never say never. We would love to imagine the day that we can help the US as well. But it's actually a really interesting challenge to try to solve this first in countries that are screaming for this because they need it that badly.
Yeah.
So that's the goal. And as a marketer, it's fascinating because I have never focused on these markets as primary markets versus secondary markets, and talk about really not being able to make assumptions about your audience.
Yeah.
That's more true here than ever before.
Right, right. Wow. Well, that's super exciting, man. Big revenue opportunities, it sounds like, with the growth in those economies and just the percentage of the population that's unbanked or underbanked. So, and I can see you guys are killing it.
Absolutely.
I'm on LinkedIn right now. Looks like I'm just on the insights tab. You've grown, it looks like 42% over 2 years in terms of headcount, which is a very rapid clip. Um, I'm curious, like, what is really driving your revenue engine? Like, if you think about go to market motions or traffic sources, like, where are most of your leads and prospects and deals coming from?
Well, so this is something we've pivoted a little bit. We were running a pretty heavy sales led motion. We had a sales team, that was uh, endemic within Latin America and within Africa. And so just working a lot of, contacts and kind of starting that way. In the need to get more efficient, though, as you mentioned, like the CAC was actually pretty tough. And it was a good way to get started and get in deep with some of those industries where we knew we needed to get traction, but we are really in the middle of pivoting now to a much more marketing-led and inbound driven motion. And so this is where free tier becomes a lot more important. We've seen some really good traction from folks who start for free. So we basically give you 300 verifications for free. So you can actually hook it up to your website. You can pick which data you need, and you can actually start the process of onboarding folks and see it firsthand and see what the results are. And so that's been really useful for us. And then, the more we have really come to understand our audience, the more we've really come to understand what resonates with them and what's going to get them to leave the current ways that they do this, because of course all of them are already doing something to determine whether to accept a current customer or not.
Yeah.
Uh, as we get that messaging tighter, it's given us more confidence to lean more deeply into demand generation as well. So from an efficiency standpoint, I think we've dropped our acquisition cost by like 75% over the course of this year. So
Wow.
that gives us the confidence to start to turn up that money spigot and spend more even in an economy like this.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. That's really cool. So as we round out the year here and you look forward to 2024, like what are some of the big things on your roadmap or like some of the things you're investing in or some of the big initiatives that you guys see on the horizon?
Yeah, I think two big areas. One is still continuing to uh, dig deeper into audience understanding. I
Yeah.
think there are definitely there's the cultural aspect. There are a couple of different audiences we're dealing with. Another interesting thing about Latin America is a lot of the loans that are happening there are actually from retailers. So when you
Mm,
buy a cell phone, even a pair of shoes, we've got a shoe company that basically, you can buy on credit.
yeah.
So all of these companies that aren't traditionally financial companies suddenly are. We see that somewhat here too, right? Apple launches the Apple Card, and
Mm,
you can kind of get loans from a bunch of different companies now. But there, it's really turning these companies into a different type of company. So that's interesting. But understanding exactly what a retail company wants from us versus a ride sharing company. So ride sharing companies use us not just for getting a loan, although they do give loans to some of their drivers to help kind of pay for a car, but also just understanding who to hire, right? And
yeah.
understanding kind of how to vet them from that standpoint. So there's these different use cases, and I think there's more we still need to really understand about each of these audiences and what's keeping them up at night, so that we can connect kind of more, just more powerfully with these folks and more successfully on a consistent basis. So we have some pretty deep audience initiatives we want to do, both to better understand those who are successfully using us right now. And we do have over 600 customers. So we have quite a lot to choose from. It's just a question of understanding who are most typical and who are kind of, we have a lot of kind of smaller users. Um, so that's a big initiative. And then the other area in the realm of efficiency is we really want to ramp up what we're doing on the customer side. So um, we still are fairly high touch from a service standpoint, just like you were talking about earlier. Um, in another instance, but we still use humans to really help fix a lot of things. And I think to hit the efficiency goals we want to hit, I think we really need to make more of this self-serve. I actually think it leads to a better product experience also, where our banks and financial institutions can really see all of the choices available to them. Our goal is to ultimately help you make the right decisions based on your risk tolerance, what you're trying to do, and your business objectives. So, in a lot of ways, the more we can expose that inner decision making to them and let them sort of have at the controls of a master dashboard, the better. So, it's really working alongside product, customer success, to see if we can start to build a more automated version of this, but that involves a lot more communication. And so that's really where marketing comes in as well. So that to me is a really fascinating area here too, where it's not just customer acquisition, but how do you actually continue to build on that promise and build a better customer experience on the back end? And frankly, get a lot more data. Like I see a bunch more experiments in my future when I think about how we could run that self-serve uh, motion kind of for current customers.
Yeah, so it would almost be like, customer logs in, they see their current criteria. There might be like an estimate of like, this will probably be 97% effective. So it's relatively stringent. But then they could tweak some of the variables or some of the requirements and be like, this will be 85% accurate. And so you'll get more volume through, but you might get like some scammers or some bad actors at a higher rate with this criteria. Is that kind of what you're envisioning?
Exactly right. And it wouldn't be a marketing podcast if we didn't mention AI at least once.
Right.
So, we already are using AI on the back end for this, but yes, the idea is to improve that more and more, where it really starts to coach you and suggest things, but ultimately it's your decision, because the reality is, like you said, different financial institutions have different levels of risk they're willing to take. We've seen that throughout our history, and so we don't want to be sort of the arbiter of saying like, nope, that's too risky. Like, it's ultimately up to the company to decide, because we don't think there's perfect information out there for any given institution. And so That's the idea exactly, is to kind of coach you and help you, but let you make the decision while showing you what it believes the consequences will be, and then allowing you to track it on the back end.
That's super cool, man. Well, exciting for you. This has been an awesome conversation. It's inspired me to test more often, but I'm really excited for you guys because you're sort of in this state where you have some traction, you have some resources, but there's still just a lot of unexplored terrain, and it's almost like there's a lot of exciting things to be uncovered, and I'm sure you guys will do very well.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's the fun of it. I think a lot of us get into marketing because we're curious types and because we want to sort of learn and create and try to, gauge the results on the back end. So to me, it's what keeps me excited about this as the field that I'm in. Like it never makes the day boring.
Right. Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you very much for coming on here today, Dan. I think this was really awesome. And for everybody listening, if you enjoyed this, if you learned anything, or if you laughed a little bit, drop us a like, share this with a friend, or give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your pods. We sure would appreciate that. Um, Dan, you want to do the lightning round? Do you have
Yeah, let's
time?
do it. Of course.
All
I
right,
mean, it
cool.
wouldn't be your podcast without the lightning round, right?
Nice. All right, cool. So, question number one is, if you were to start a side hustle, what side hustle would that be?
Well, I love all forms of media. I'm pretty media obsessed. So my simple answer is a journalist. I could imagine being a journalist in another life. They're amazing storytellers. My more complicated answer would be, I think there is a startup idea that is some sort of aggregation of all of this micro media that's around us now, right? There's streams coming from every type of a website. There's obviously TV, whatever TV is anymore. There's podcasts, newsletters, like I there's music. Like I am obsessed with finding the right stuff for me, and frankly, I would be willing to give up a lot about myself to get a more optimal stream. So I think someone's got to do it. It's not cable anymore. It's something way bigger than that. I think
Yeah,
I think that would be a fun idea. I think you could sell a ton of advertising against it. So either journalist or that, whatever that is,
that's a good idea. I like that idea a lot. And
you can
I
have it.
found I found an app recently. I'm trying to think of the name of it, but it was like that. But the only media was like news articles. Like it didn't have music or anything like.
Right. Yeah, there's quite a few of those, right. It's kind of like an RSS reader, but for every type of media in your life.
Right, right. Cool. I like that. Question number two is top three books, authors, influencers, podcasts, any information source that has really made an impact on you.
Yeah, this was a tough one. So, it was hard to name only 3, but I'm gonna go with, number 1, the book Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard
Mm,
Rummelt.
okay.
Um, we talked a couple times today about being methodical, and what I think is really interesting about that book is uh, he treats strategy, which is a very abused word, as he points out as well, in
Yeah.
a very methodical way, but while acknowledging there are no easy answers. Like I detest business books that are like step one, step two, step three. So it's challenging in that way, but he does talk about staying focused, defining that challenge or opportunity, then channeling all of your energy into solving that by picking specific approaches and a set of coherent actions. It's really about being very intentful, very focused. And I've learned a lot from it. And I really try to take a lot from it because in startups, there are 1,000 things competing for your attention. And I
Yeah.
am this big believer in making huge leaps forward. We talked about it with experiments, but making sure it's all building towards those core things that matter. Otherwise, you have a day where you were very, very busy, but you actually didn't get that much done that moves the business forward. So that's my
Yep.
first one.
It
My
happens all
second
the time.
one, oh, sorry, go ahead.
That just happen I would say that happens to me all the
Oh,
time. I'm sure it happens to many people.
I'm
Just
guilty of it too.
yeah.
Totally. My second is a more from left field. It's a book called Start Where You Are
Mhm.
by Pema Chodron, who's a Buddhist nun.
Okay.
And the way she puts it is it's about like cultivating fearlessness and awakening a compassionate heart. Those are her words. But I think it's really about, and it is about, kind of principles of Buddhism. Again, it wouldn't be Silicon Valley if we weren't talking about something
Mhm.
like that. But I think we've all tried to use the meditation app, and maybe a lot of us haven't been as successful. To me,
Yeah.
this is kind of the philosophy that helps me better understand it. And it really is about keeping life in perspective, living in a current moment, holding the good with the bad. It all matters, and it's all um, to be absorbed and not kind of pushed away. And I think there's something really important in there because, I'm now on my third startup and I've just come to realize it's just a nonstop rush of stuff, right? There's highs, there's lows, there's stresses. And I think you've got to be able to pull yourself out from that stream and just kind of live with it a little bit, or this thing will grind you down. And so that's been a really important balancing piece for me to be able to kind of like clear my brain and jump back in the next day, whether you do the meditation or not. Just that perspective has really helped me.
I like that one. I'll check that out. Cool. How about number 3?
Number 3, well, I said I like all forms of micromedia, so I can't just go with books.
Yeah.
So I am going to go with the podcast. It's
Mhm.
also a little out there. It's not a marketing podcast. It's called Heavyweight, um, with this guy Jonathan Goldstein. And every episode, he meets someone. Most of the time, he's never met them before, and he's helping them either reconnect with someone or solve something they were never quite able to solve on their own. It's less of a mystery, and it's more of just a problem in their life, something they wanted to kind of tackle. It's often very, very funny. But the reason I choose it is I actually think it's a masterclass in the power of narrative. Like, he is such an amazing storyteller. And we talked a lot about science today, but the art side is, like I said earlier, why I got into marketing. It's the beauty. Like, marketing should make you cry at times, it should make you laugh. And I think this podcast to me is a really helpful reminder of that. I can tell you of an episode where someone tried to figure out why their babysitter stopped visiting. That sounds like the worst podcast ever, but he makes it about something far deeper. It's about human connection and, you know, your hopes and aspirations as a kid versus when you grow up. And all of a sudden he takes this thing that seemed like such a basic story and turns it into this like amazing illustrative story about life. And so anyways, I just think he's a master at it. And I
Yeah.
learn from him all the time. It's highly enjoyable. So when you've had enough like marketing speak, throw on Heavyweight, and I guarantee you'll enjoy it.
Cool. Yeah. I might have to turn that on the ride home today. That sounds really interesting.
Please start at the beginning.
All right. Good. Good. I will. Um, cool. And question number 3 is, how do you avoid burnout, and how do you help your team to avoid burnout as well?
Well, this probably won't surprise you that, given some of those recommendations I just gave, it's not all about marketing. It's not all about kind of that world. In fact, my favorite thing about marketing, I said before, it attracts curious people. Is I really think it attracts. You're going to be better at marketing if you can live a more interesting life, and so I really try to avoid burnout by doing as many different things as I can when I
Mm.
have time. So it's definitely getting outside, got to get my dogs around the block, got to exercise,
Yeah.
pushing my own creativity. I actually have a podcast, Chris. It's not quite as buttoned up as yours, with
Oh.
a couple of buddies where we rank albums from worst song to best song. It's called We Will Rank You. So that's a lot of
Oh,
fun.
nice. That's awesome.
I'm part of an improv troupe. And then, just human time, friends and family. And I personally work from home. So it's a lot of Zoom calls. And I think it just becomes really important to reconnect with humans as humans.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, we're humans. We're trying to sell to other humans. And you can look at spreadsheets all day, but you have to remember at the end of the day that it's a human making an emotional decision. I think that's a big part of what I try to keep in mind every day as I do this.
Nice. Well, that's great advice. Dan, thank you so much. This has been awesome. I'm sure that everybody has enjoyed it thoroughly. I've learned a lot. I've been inspired also. For folks that want to learn more about you or MetaMap, where would you direct them?
Well, metamap.com is the website. If you want to check that out, there's going to be a new version by the end of the year. So we're racing towards that.
Okay.
And you can find me and reach out to me on LinkedIn as well.
Very good. All right, everybody. Well, that was another exciting episode of Revenue Driven CMO. We will see you next time. And that's a wrap. Thanks for joining us here today. For show notes and other episodes, visit us at revenuedrivencmo.com. That's revenuedrivencmo.com. And hey, exclusive for listeners of this podcast, Web Mechanics will do 10 to 20 hours of work for you for free. Literally no sales calls, no BS. Just give them a problem and they will put a team to work for you for free for 10 to 20 hours, even if you're already a client. If you're struggling with demand gen, lead gen, SEO, SEM, Google ads, LinkedIn ads, conversion optimization, if you can't get Facebook or Meta ads to work for the life of you, or you can't figure out attribution, Web Mechanics will take a good hard look at whatever problem you give them, whatever programs you put in front of them, and they will give you an objective, informed opinion, plus some advice from 10 to 20 hours of senior level attention. And that's just because you're a listener of this podcast. So I would suggest take them up on this offer. It's ridiculous. Go to revenuedrivencmo.com/free, fill out the 2-minute form, and you will not regret it. Literally zero downside, unlimited potential for growth. So do yourself a favor, revenuedrivencmo.com/free, no hyphens, no punctuations. You will be happy about that decision.